Welcome to another episode of Raiders of the Unknown. We are still broadcasting under Mystic Skeptic Radio. And I know we've been heavy on spiritual subjects and specifically anti-Semitism, the historical Jesus, and biblical traditions that have been passed down through modern or classical Judaism. And today we have a new co-host, Mr. Tony, who I would like for you to share a little bit about your background and how you got interested in the subject. But the subject that we're discussing is a very tough subject. And the reason I bring it up, and we've done a series on the rise of anti-Semitism, but it just keeps on rearing its ugly head. And I had multiple difficult conversations online. So I'll save that until after Tony introduces himself. And then I'll introduce myself a little bit too, because I've been wanting to do more station IDs, tell people about our show. Our format is just an hour conversation, something that's a little bit longer, and you can find that on our YouTube. But it's just a straight shot. Like we don't stop, we don't take breaths, we just keep going. And it's an in-depth look in whatever topic we're discussing. But Tony, tell us about your interest on these subjects and why is it important to stay informed?
All right, so I came from a Christian background, and I noticed as I kind of delved into the teachings of Christianity, I started noticing some anomalies and some things that were unjustly, and I don't think people are doing it consciously. I think it's just been like something that's been inherited somewhat, but the sort of anti-Semitism and a lot of doctrine and a lot of issues and disdain towards Judaism and Jews in general. And so I started asking some difficult questions. This God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what does it mean that this Jesus movement came on the scene? And you have this God of Israel that's saying that Israel is the apple of his eye, and he has a special relationship with this nation of people. And, it's like I started seeing things to where the Jesus movement and the proponents for it would almost take this inherently Jewish text, considered the New Testament, and almost making it an indictment against all Jews. And it really gave put a distaste in my mouth because I just didn't understand, because I grew up from more of an atheistic, more agnostic background. And so I didn't come into faith in God until I was in my early 20s. And so though my background, I say, is in Christianity, it's not like I was raised in it, and I didn't really understand the traditions. I didn't understand the doctrinal differences of denomination and sectarianism. And so I would just, when I would read the Bible, I would see God having this relationship with his people. And then it's like I had these other people over here saying this New Testament writings are an indictment against these people for all generations. And it just didn't make sense. It didn't go along with the whole theme of Scripture, of what I see when I was reading Scripture. And so a couple of years ago, I started delving into Jewish texts and reading Talmudic writings, rabbinical texts. And a lot of what I was taught about those texts were very biased and slandering, and a grave misrepresentation of the Jewish people from the outside view. And when I started reading these texts and starting understanding how Jews think and how they think theologically and eschatologically, it really opened my eyes to the the need to correspond with Jewish people. I consider the Jewish people as my people, part of, we love the same God, we worship the same God, and so it just didn't make any sense to why there was this disdain between these two groups of peoples, but primarily Gentile believers and Jewish believers. Because even within certain groups of Jesus movement, whether it be nominal Christianity or Messianic Judaism, there's still this separation that to me it just didn't make any sense, because the whole overall theme of Scripture, again, what I see is about moral behavior. It's about loving people, being kind. Regardless if you disagree with somebody, you can still approach something and be loving and kind and not be degrading or marginalizing of certain people groups. And so I think it's very important that especially people from my background of Christianity to approach things from a more, I would say, academic perspective, and look at things more objectively, and try to look for and ask the questions. Ask as many questions as you can. Why is this? And then not just that, but also taking into account history. I think a lot of people don't understand that there's a lot of baggage and there's a lot of trauma built into the Jesus movement, and since people aren't really cognitive, they're not really knowledgeable, or they don't think about it. That when someone brings up the name Jesus or different variations of that name, there's trauma that comes with it because of the last 2,000 years. And it's created this division, and it completely doesn't make sense because of the unity I see that God wants with humanity. And so I think these are very pressing topics. And with the times that we're in the modern age, I think it would be first off, to the name of Hashem, to settle these differences, because the more and more society completely becomes more secular and secular. It doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you're on. If you represent God and morality and ethics of the scriptures and God's ways, then we're going to be marginalized with the Jewish people anyways, and we're going to need one another. And I think that's very important because we're on the same team. We stand for basically the same things, morally and ethically. And so I think that discussions like these can really help the matter, and to bring to light things that people don't really understand and know about. So the anti-Semitism, the reading scripture certain ways, certain translations, how they've taken certain translations and kind of added things in there that aren't originally in the manuscripts, that kind of would point as Jews or evil or bad. And then also the perspective that we see that, you've got the prophets coming to Israel, and it's not fair that we see Israel in the light of being chastised by God. And it's not fair because it's like Israel is on this platform for the whole world to see, because the Hebrew scriptures have gone out to the whole four corners of the earth. And there's no other nation that's under as much of a fine tooth and microscope than Israel has been for the last 2,000 years, due to the Hebrew scriptures going out to the whole earth. And so, and I think what that does is it paints Israel in a bad light, and people don't look at it from a humanistic perspective. And so I think from my studies and what I've tried to do is, funny thing is I live in Alabama, and there's not a heavy Jewish community here. So the only thing I had ever heard about Jews was always secondhand. It was always from the mouth of another person, and it was never from a fellow Jew, right? So it's always when I finally started fellowshipping and learning from Jewish people online, rabbis, it opened the door for me to ask questions, to get to know the Jewish community and the Jewish people. Like, what do you, and just to see the differences, but also to let them know, like, listen, I love you as a brother. We worship the same God, and I have no disdain for you. And I'm a little different than most people within the, that were part of the Jesus movement, but my thing is like, I think baseless hatred is unacceptable. And I think educating ourselves and getting to know one another is crucial. I think that's one of the first steps. Instead of always coming with this theological condescending attitude sometimes, as if like we always have to debate. We're human beings. All of us are human beings. And so I think everything should be approached with kindness, love, respect, and never any type of condemnation or judgment or hatred towards one another. That we've had 2,000 years of that. It's time to put that to rest. I mean, I think that's crucial to both communities reconciling the things that from the atrocities that have happened in the past. We need to learn from that past so we can grow, so we can represent the God that we worship in a better way for those that in the world that don't know about God. So
Wonderful.
Thanks for having me on, though, by the way.
Thank you, Tony. And one of my pet peeves is that some religious leaders or scholars, they try to make things so complicated that it takes someone who's has a PhD themselves to try to figure things out. And I remember there was an interview with Reza Aslan, and I've talked about him peripherally in our show. He's a gentleman from the Middle East who was originally evangelical Christian, and then he went back to Islam or recognized how the tradition of his ancestors was more viable for him. And every time he gets asked about the existence of God, about Muslim writings, about the Quran, he always says it takes some level of sophistication to be able to make heads or tails on those texts. And I'm like, if you have to be sophisticated, where you have to use some critical method or some type of understanding of the culture and tradition to be able to make sense of it, then it's only clerics and leaders who have access to the truth, and then they have to disseminate it. So I feel that part of the problem in also Judaism and Christianity is that the leaders have not been good in communicating how can we understand other communities and their perspective, and that part of being a good leader is also not making sure that you are not leading the charge against certain groups to make a case for your perspective. So Jews have been the punching bag for 2,000 years. And what I wrote in an article, that we've been the punching bag from not only the prevalent Western religion, which is Christianity, not only the prevalent Eastern religion, which is Islam, but now we're the punching bag for the secular community, the white and black supremacist groups, and possibly even the people that don't know anything about Jews, like the communists and other folks who they just, there's something about non-compliant folks that people don't like. So somebody, I think it was the guy that sprung up this conversation, said, well, you need to be more self-reflective. Why is it that everybody hates the Jews? You must be doing something wrong. But that's almost like blaming the victim for getting beat up. It's a bully tactic to not take any responsibility. So the topic that we're discussing today is, are the Jews in league with the devil? And I know it's a very loaded subject, but we have to start from the beginning. And again, to simplify things and to be a good communicator on the aspect of religion and religious anthropology and history, we have to make sense of what is all this stuff. Like if someone says the Jews are at fault for this, or the Jews are demonic or something like that, there's a lot of assumptions that are being brought to the forefront. Like, is there even a devil to begin with? When you were saying that people see God reprimanding the Jews, well, is God a hateful God, or is God a loving God? Like, there's so many things. But if we do a quick survey of what is even Judaism and where did all these ideas come from, I was reading an article about how there's a theory that the God of Israel, which is described with the tetragrammaton, or the ineffable name in Judaism, which is most people use Yahweh or Jehovah or whatever, which we don't like, that there's a possibility that it was a deity from the Midianites. And it's interesting that if you look, especially around Yom Kippur, which is coming up, they say that Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, was a great man, and he was a priest of the Most High, and he's seen as the greatest of all Gentiles. So whenever you hear people saying, well, the Jews are tribalistic and hateful of the Gentiles, and they want nothing to do with peoples of the nations, now there's a theory that says that actually Moses studied under a priest of this deity, which later became the deity of the Hebrews. We don't know if that's the truth or what was going on back then, but to think that God was borrowed or God was already known by other tribes which were not Hebraic or from Canaan, they were from Median, and that was incorporated into the greater narrative of the ancient Jewish people, or known back then as Hebrews or Israelites, doesn't sound that bad. Like, okay, so one group recognized that there was a all-powerful creator, and they were under the leadership of the Egyptians, and all they had access to was the knowledge of the gods of the Egyptians, because it had been 400 years since the revelation to Abraham. So what is it that God was in communication with peoples from other tribes, and then Moses met one of them, married his daughter, and became a representative of that deity. So even the origins of Judaism are very universalistic if you look at it like that. But most people think that some guy, either Abraham or Moses, came up with something and then forced it on his followers, and then they became so dismissive of every other nation. They went and conquered and destroyed everybody who stood in their way, including the Egyptians. In the movie, was it Exodus, Gods and Kings? Christian Bale said that Moses was like a terrorist, and that he was holding the Egyptians captive, and by killing the son of the king, he was forcing them to do things they never wanted to do, such as let the people go. So there's all kinds of crazy interpretations and foolish ways that you can flip things on the Jews. But from all that, people ascertain that the Jews are kind of sneaky or always in conflict. And then they'll take passages where that deity is disappointed with the way they're behaving, and usually it comes from a sense of justice, a sense of love and respect for humanity, telling the Israelites that they should behave better, that God expects more from them. And then they'll take a psalm that says something like, you went after other gods, you disappointed me, and then they apply it to all Jews throughout history. In the time of Jesus, they would apply something like that and make them feel guilty or shame them for their misbehavior. And that's where the whole being in league with the devil comes from. But as you were reading the text I sent you about apocalyptic literature, Tony, what did you find about, because what people don't understand is that gap that you saw between the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament is what matters. What happened in those 400 years between Malachi and Jesus that brought about all this conflict? I don't know if you noticed, but when Jesus walks into the scene, it's all conflict and fighting. And him and John D. Mercer are the ones who are starting the fight. It's not, you could say that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are going around mistreating people, but they're calling them out. And if you notice, the prophets, and including Moses, they're the ones that go and tell Pharaoh or the kings or whoever, you need to stop. So the moment that you pin yourself against authority, you are going to have pushback. So what authority or what conflict was Jesus starting? And does that have anything to do with the spiritual realm that people already believed in? What did you ascertain from the document I sent you, Tony, in relation to apocalyptic literature, and where is that in the midst of all these writings?
Well, I think there is this development of this apocalypticism in the literature, and when I was getting through it, some of the thesis there was that the Jewish people adopted this idea from other nations, from, I think it was from Persia or something like that. But then the conclusion was that they didn't. It was It was more organic within the nation of Israel. And so it's very fascinating that there is this time gap and that there's this complete silence. And then you have this just emergence of this Jesus movement where John the Immerser, and then you've got Jesus coming around and criticizing the leadership of Israel of the day. And it's a fascinating topic. And I look forward to delving deeper into it because we're getting into what we're treading into waters that are more academic and scholarly that, you know, in your basic church setting or synagogue setting, you don't really get to hear about. It takes actually doing the work to find these things. And, but it's just fascinating how I've noticed over any topic regarding the Hebrew scriptures, like you said, you know, talking about Jethro and the Midianite priest, that maybe the Jewish people adopted it from there. And then you have also scholars that say, well, this deity that holds the name of the Tetragrammaton, it was borrowed from the Canaanites, you know, and it's just like, well, why is it the Jewish people are always, everything the Jewish people say or write about is always under high scrutiny? Why can't it be just as the scriptures say, right? So there's always this kickback. Oh, well, the Jews don't know anything. They adopted this. They did that. They're, you know, and I think it goes along with this whole theme of this underlying issue of, you know, anti-Semitism.
Well, you know, the development of religion is a tricky subject because there is evidence that some of the Psalms or some of the writings have a correlation from, you know, the worship of Baal, the worship of El, which was the god of the Canaanites, and things like that. But one thing that you said that it was crucial in your beginning statement was that when you look at the Torah or the rest of the writings and the prophetic utterances, they come from suffering. They come from being under the boot of the Babylonians or the Syrians. So if you believe in some of the historical stuff that's come up, they are reflecting on what their ancestors went through. So let's say that you know, you want to have successes, but you also want to be honest about the failures. So when you look at the Bible, it talks about how human people are. That's why people from all different backgrounds have connected to the patriarchs, the prophets. They're very human. They make mistakes. They acknowledge their problems. They grow. All that stuff is written within it. But also there's another narrative of being mistreated, being dismissed, being conquered, and all that plays an important part on what's happening. So when you go into a foreign, well, it says that the land was originally theirs through the promise to Abraham, and then they went into the Canaanite. They were having all kinds of influences and mostly negative, and that's why they became so insular and they wanted to preserve the religion. The aspect that is important that you said is that people assume that nothing Jewish is noble or created from scratch, that everything is an influence. So they're like the perfect thieves of ideas. And that's another kind of anti-Semitic trope that comes up. But then Christians make this assumption that everything before Jesus was borrowed or stolen or disservice to humanity. I even read an article where it said that a church father prompted this, and someone agreed that Judaism is a carnal religion because we're like the pagans. Our forms of worship require sacrifice. Our everything is a physical manifestation, and that's a very paganized perspective. And that even though it comes from God, it's still trash. But Jesus is a new revelation, a new way of seeing things, which is pure and straight from God, and everything before him is ridiculous. So again, they are imposing their Greek philosophy, their understanding of the world onto a very ancient people, and they're not giving them any ability to breathe. Like you're making it so tight, and they have to fall within certain parameters, or if not, is inconsequential. Since you're dealing with people who come from suffering, everything they describe is in relation to being in the need of a higher power. That's why God has such a prevalent role in the Hebrew scriptures. You turn to the New Testament, and they had just experienced the destruction of the temple. They had just experienced the death of their messianic figure. They had just experienced the persecution and martyrdom of many of their leaders. So everything that they're writing is also coming from suffering. So that's the thread, the thing that they have in common. But they were both persecuted as Jews. That's what people don't see, is that before Christian anti-Semitism or Greco-Roman anti-Semitism, you had Egyptian anti-Hebrew and anti-Israelite, and Babylonian anti-Hebrew Israelite, and Syrian, and also Greek. So there's a thread of them being persecuted, and that's what all the stories are about. But the gap in between is them looking forward to a day where that won't take place anymore. And they have almost like a Excalibur mentality, that we had a great King David, and now we're hoping for a great son of David, or David returning, or something like that, to create a more healthy environment and less destruction. So the apocalyptic writings serve as a buffer between what they want to happen and what they're experiencing. And then you have the New Testament writers who are saying some of it has already happened, but not to its fullest extent. And we had one of the hosts from the Apocalyptic Gospel podcast mentioned that they were projecting or hoping that their day was the day of redemption, and it wasn't happening. So they were applying a lot of prophetic stuff into themselves, just like all other apocalyptic groups. So that's going to lead us to the next part, and we have 10 minutes before the break, but I want to read to you what prompted this, other than some Facebook guy attacking all Jews and then me personally. But this perspective is something that needs to be taken into consideration, because it's really easy to throw out the devil this, the antichrist that, without seeing the implications and the possibility of perpetuating ongoing hatred for the Jewish people. And again, they'll say, well, I'm not talking about the current Jewish people, like the neo-Nazi guy was. I'm talking about just in general, that all Jews need to understand this, and this is what Jesus was talking about. So you have to consider the source. So anybody that has some type of Germanic last name, you already know where they're coming from, and we'll get to it in a moment, and I'll tell you the name of the author. So this guy's talking about Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are the texts written by possibly the Essenes, who were out in the desert. They had problems with everyone, just like Jesus and John the Immerser. So they said, we're going to step out from the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and we're going to create our own temple and our own way of worshiping God based on the Levitical priesthood. And most likely they were descendants of Zadok, which was one of the priests in the time of King David and Solomon. So that's where the names Sadducee comes from. But these were an offshoot Sadducean group, which were more faithful than the Sadducees that sold out to Rome. So according to an article by Jörg Frey called Qumran, Early Judaism and New Testament Interpretation, it's actually a book. In CDV 1719, this is one of the apocalyptic texts from Qumran, the struggle between Moses and Aaron and the Egyptian magicians Jannes and Jambres is depicted as a struggle between the Prince of Light and Belial. Belial is mentioned twice in the Tanakh or Hebrew scriptures, and it's like disobedience, wickedness, something like that. And then later it became one of the many demons that were against God, similar to Satan. Belial functions as the origin of temptation in Israel's history and presence, as the angel of destruction punishing the wicked. Thus, the sapitential tradition of an ethical dualism is clearly embedded into a reinforced cosmetic dualism with a division of humankind at the border of the community. Consequently, the idea of an ambulance within the heart of any of the members is dropped. So they're saying that if you're a bad guy, it's because you're being led by some satanic demonic character, typical basic religion. In another aspect in relation to this, he says, quote, early Christian theology is not conceivable without the thorough impact of contemporary Jewish apocalypticism, or at least of some of its motives. The thought world of the early Jesus of Nazareth was strongly shaped by apocalyptic motives and terms, probably originally inspired by John the Baptizer. Prominent concepts and terms such as the kingdom of God, the Son of Man, the eschatological judgment, the resurrection of the dead, the imagery of a struggle between a strong one and an even stronger one, the imagery of an eschatological meal, and the announcement of an eschatological change of the situation of the poor, the hungry, and the weeping in the earliest macarisms of all signs of a clearly apocalyptic thought world, and even the idea of the kingdom which is yet to come and in his works already present, attest to the reinforced rather than the reduced apocalyptic viewpoint. So that's everything we've talked about, but some people think that it's also not inherent in Judaism or ancient Jewish thought, that it was borrowed from the Zoroastrians, and we can talk about that later. Within the apocalyptic thought world, early Christian authors and texts also adopted various elements of apocalyptic dualism, although a direct borrowing from Qumran cannot be confirmed. As in Judaism, dualism can at most be moderate, not radical or absolute. No power can be considered equal to God, the creator and the ruler of the universe. With these limits, different types of dualisms were adopted. Cosmic dualism, God/Christ versus Satan; ethical, good versus evil, spirit versus flesh; and eschatological, final, eternal salvation or punishment, dualism. Jesus reckoned with demonic spirits causing illness and destruction. They're considered to be subject to a governing power. Satan, such as in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, and Mark chapter 3, verse 23, or Beelzebub, as in Mark chapter 3, verse 22. Although the concept is not totally consistent, New Testament texts rather stress the conviction that Satan's power is already broken by the power of the kingdom, as may manifest in Jesus' exorcism. Paul refers to Satan as one who tempts and deceives, 1 Corinthians 7:5, 2 Corinthians 2:11, and he even calls him the God of this eon, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Also Beliar in 2 Corinthians 6:15. But at the same time, he's convinced that Satan will be defeated shortly, such in Romans 16:20. Paul's Pauline epistles mention Satan, for now the diabolos, as one who stimulates heresy, sin, and apostasy. Only Jude 6 and 2 Peter adopt the tale of the fall of the angels, which comes from Enoch. Again, another apocryphal work that was written between the two testaments. Jude 9, furthermore, adopts the struggle of Michael and the devil over Moses' corpse from the lost ending of the Testament of Moses. The Johannine writings, this is the Gospels, the letters of John, and the Book of Revelation, which some people say the Book of Revelation was written by somebody else, and possibly the letters too, more thoroughly shaped by elements of dualistic language. They not only mention opposing powers such as Satan, the diabolos, and the ruler of this world, whose power is considered to be broken in Jesus' death. Even more significant is the intense use of pairs of opposites such as light, darkness, truth, lie, death, life, above and below. This language was often thought to be adopted from a particular history of religious background, either Gnostic or Qumranic. We're going to stop there to make a point. Let's say that Daniel Boyarin, who's a Talmudic scholar, is right, and it was a mystical, Jewish mystical perspective, not a Gnostic one. A lot of people say, why was Jesus always talking about secrets and wisdom that nobody can relate to, and knowledge and faith and belief, when all those things weren't part of Judaism? They talk about emunah in Jewish circles, but they never talk about secret knowledge and mysteries and stuff like that. There was all of that in its nascent way as it was happening, and that was all in the apocalyptic literature. So Kabbalah is to reveal something that is hidden. So it's proto-Kabbalah. Kabbalah didn't really become a thing until like the 2nd century, but it's early Jewish mysticism that all that can be related to. So if Jesus is saying, if you know me, you know this, or you don't understand because it hasn't been revealed to you, or keep it secret, or you guys would know because, or you don't know because the devil is influencing you, stuff like that. All that stuff was already taking place. As Westerns, we come and we say, oh, well, he's the divine son of God that came down and revealed all these things. But those were things that were already common and everybody knew about. And maybe it was in certain circles, but not in others. But the author made sure that that gospel itself had those elements. So he was speaking in mystical terms. If you take something mystical and you apply it in the real world, that's when you get in trouble. So in the next segment, we're going to talk about how, let's say that there is a negative force that is Satan, Beliar, or some, angel that is fighting against God. Can people be possessed by him? Can people become influenced by him? And can people be accused of being sons of the devil and stuff like that, like Jesus does? So who's really the culprit for demonizing the Jewish people? Is it Jesus, or is it the culture and the apocalyptic thinking that was already happening? And we're back to the Mystic Skeptics Radio, Raiders of the Unknown. We've done many series, including Jesus Wars, Jesus the Israelite, and the Anti-Semitism Rising. And this is like a combination of different things, because we're discussing how Jews are often associated with the devil and negative destructive forces in society. And a lot of it comes from the New Testament designation that comes from demonology that was already it was in development, because the Talmud, which was not fully finished until the 5th century, discussed some of the same demonic forces, but it's in relation to illness. The Dead Sea Scroll community, they discussed it in relation to the end of the world. And then there's pockets of they found like basins or bowls that have incantations against demonic forces. Some of them are using the name of Jesus. Some of them are in the name of Solomon. There's a story where somebody was demon possessed in the Talmud, and by a root in a ring, they were able to get the demon out. And then Jesus fought against demons left and right, and they were scared of him, and he sent them off to either to pigs, or he said they might be coming back. So there's all kinds of stuff in relation to that. But this idea, and I wrote a book that talks about a rational perspective on demonology, and I make a point about how Jesus was accused of being in league with the devil himself, and the devil that is described as this guy that we're reading in the previous segment is Beelzebub, which, if you think about it, Baal was the major antagonist of the Hebrew deity in the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, and Sebub is Akron, an area where they used to sacrifice children to Moloch and other gods. So when Jesus talks about the valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, or Gehonim in Hebrew, he's talking about an area that is also sacrificed children to Moloch. And so to say that Jesus is casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub is to say that he's a pagan worshiper, that he has access to the god Baal, and that Baal, the son of El, is what he follows. So there's all kinds of ideas of how Baal was worshipped, but he was the thunder god of the Canaanites. So it's strange that hasn't been any idolatry for the past 400 years. Nowhere in the Maccabean text or in the other apocryphal books it says the Jews are worshiping the demons, like it says in the Psalms or in the Torah. And now they're saying that he's worshiping demons, which are false gods, and that he has a connection with them, and he's able to get that out. So then he turns it around later or in a different gospel, and he says that you guys are the ones who are the children of Satan. So you can say Satan and Beelzebub are two different deities or false angels or whatever, or fallen angels. But if you read the book of Enoch, a lot of these demons are mentioned as well, and they're personified. I think that there is a reaction against idolatry. They're trying to say that the gods of the other nations are malevolent, and that's why they gave them human-like personality and angel-like personality. So then they became demons, and they're working against God. But the guy who wrote the Gospel of John and the later apostles are giving this this creature, which is supposed to be in conflict with God, based on the letters of the different versions of Enoch. He is a representative of evil, someone who rebelled against God, and now he has a whole of the world. So I asked Bill Schofield, where do we get this idea that the whole world is either under bondage of Satan and under God's wrath? Because Paul talks about it all the time, that God is angry at the universe, and the Gospel of John says that the world is already on its way out, and that Jesus is the only solution. Have you come across that, Tony, where out of left field you are seeing, God has a relationship with the Jewish people, he gives them commandments, he gives them an ability to connect with him, to worship, and then 1,000 years later, now is smackdown. We're gonna come after everyone because you're not doing what you're supposed to, and you're all condemned, and the devil is running loose. So you need this prince to show up to destroy the works of the devil, to bring out a path of away from the destruction, a lifeboat, and you get on it or you get destroyed. Is that what you gather when you started reading the New Testament, which it felt like it was a new development in a almost like a problem and a solution that was never discussed in the previous text?
Absolutely. It goes, from Malachi, and then it just abruptly stops. And then all of a sudden you have Jesus and John on the scene, just doing this, rebuking people. And like you said, speaking mystically. And so I think what helped me better understand, and still with the limited knowledge that I do have, is what I see a lot of times is when people read these texts and they try to assert things or they try to come to conclusions, a lot of times it's erroneous because they lack the historical context and the religious and sociological context of what's going on in the first century. And so with that in mind, I see it's kind of the same. I kind of see it like in the same light as all the rest of the prophets. There's a time at the time in the first century, Israel was under oppression from Rome, and they were being mistreated harshly. And during times of oppression and suffering, the people cry out to God and they ask for a savior. And I think what happens is people will read these texts and they will come to that erroneous conclusion. Because you've got Paul, right? He's a Jew. You've got Stephen making this confession in Acts. And it in a way it does, if you take away the historical context and the religious context of what's going on, it's very easy to come to a faulty conclusion. It's like Stephen, in his confession, what is recorded, it almost assumes, like if you're an outsider from like a Gentile of the nation's perspective and you're reading the text, it almost seems like there's this indictment against the Jewish people, period, as a whole. But I now that I understand, I see that as complete far from the truth. But yeah, it's very fascinating. There is this completely shift in dynamic that you go from the Tanakh and then you go into the New Testament. Very, very intriguing.
Well, and there are texts that we're not familiar with that are being quoted. I did a study on how there's a passage that says, you guys killed the prophets. And then like, which prophets? What are you talking about? They were persecuted. Jeremiah was thrown into a dungeon or whatever, but there is no conversation about the prophets being killed. And saying you guys is almost like, we had a guy from Veterans for Peace, and he was saying the Muslim community is still mad that some crusaders went over there and they killed a bunch of people. And I'm like, that was 1,000 years ago, right? And he's like, well, it doesn't matter to them. So to accuse your enemy that they are the ones that killed the prophets who were around 600 years before, it's very unfair. And you can say, well, just like the prophets were killed, now you're persecuting us. Oh, okay. So the context has a lot to do. But the book that is quoted is like the deaths of the prophets, and it talks about all these different things that are apocryphal. So now you have people who are supposed to be in communion with God. They're talking directly to what Christians call the Holy Spirit, and he's giving them hearsay and mythical polemics as ammo to attack certain groups. So that's why we have to be objective. We have to think outside of the box, because a lot of the stuff doesn't even make any sense if you look at it without being familiar with what was going on back then. So we're going to finish the article by this gentleman that caused all the trouble I've been in the last couple of days, and I'll explain more afterward. So we keep going. The various terms point to different backgrounds, and they're used in John with particular rhetorical intention to draw readers from darkness to light rather than as a fixed worldview. The notion of a satanic adversary is most fully developed in the only apocalyptic writing in the New Testament, in Revelation, where Satan's names are accumulated. Chapter 12, verse 9. He and his hosts are said to face eternal punishment. Chapter 20, verse 10. But at present, they have permission to harm the Christians. Chapter 12 through 17. Even here, the dualism is a very moderate one. All evil powers are subject to and limited by the power of the one God. Dualistic concepts are rather used to qualify the enemies of the communities, the Roman power as well as the synagogue. Revelation 2:9-9. The Jews and also deviant or heretic Christians. So Revelation 2 verse 9 and 3:9 is you are those who say they are Jews and they are not, but they are part of the synagogue of Satan. And in the Greek it says synagogue. Someone had said that it's interesting that the churches are called something, and then when you talk about the Jewish congregations, they're called synagogues. So someone purposely made sure that the congregations of Jews who believe in Jesus is called a church. Congregation of Jews that doesn't believe in Jesus is called a synagogue. And then to add it on, it's not only a synagogue, but it's a synagogue of Satan. So Jesus went to synagogue, regular, but then at one point it became the synagogue of Satan if you were opposed to the Christian community. So when it says that the power of the devil and the enemies of God and the Roman powers are all tied in to the enemies of God, which includes the synagogue, the Jews, and the deviant heretic Christians. I don't see any heretic hunting in the book of Revelation, other than Jesus telling the churches that they're being unfaithful to him. That's completely different. If your father comes and says, hey, I need you to shape up, that's completely different than saying, hey, you left us and now you're going against our values. It's like, I want you to behave within our community. So I don't know where this guy's getting that. So the next part says, thus 1 and 2 John explicitly draw on the concept of an antichrist, bear with me, and label the deviant teachers as antichrist. 2 John chapter 7, 1 John chapter 2, 18, and 4:3. This survey of the reception of dualistic concept in early Christian texts shows how deeply early Christianity is indebted to Jewish concepts, and no least to the apocalyptic thought world. The view of eschatological opponents, the idea of demonic spirits, the concept of struggle with evil or misleading powers, the expectation of the end of the world to come, Revelation 21, and the eschatological division between those who will be saved and those who will be rejected are all traces of concepts from the dualisms developed in early Jewish apocalypticism. Again, this is Jörg Frey, Qumran, Early Judaism, and New Testament Interpretation. So this guy, just like many scholars now, are saying, I'm not being anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. I'm just stating the facts. The facts are the book of Revelation says that the Jews are in league with Satan. That's not me. That was John. John was a Jew. If he wants to call his people who have nothing to do with his beliefs in Jesus the synagogue of Satan, that's his prerogative. I'm just stating the facts. Well, the problem with this is that he doesn't understand that before you start pointing out the things, you have to start from the logical situation, which is, if it's truly the John that was a disciple of Jesus or some other guy, his knowledge of Jewish eschatology and apocalyptic stuff is shown. So most likely he was a Jew. So you have a Jew who claims he had a revelation from Jesus the Jew that appeared to him in Patmos and told him, all these people are misbehaving. And how are they misbehaving? They're eating food sacrificed to idols, which is in Leviticus, you're not supposed to. They are full of sexual immorality, which Leviticus also says is not part of a Jewish lifestyle. They are acting immorally, unjustly. They are mistreating widows. They are sleeping around with Jezebel, whoever that lady is. They are doing things that go against a Jewish value system or a Jewish Christian value system, which is, let's say that it's not what they would call a mainstream Jewish, which that doesn't even exist back then. Say it's not in line with the majority of the Judaisms of that time. Let's say it's a sectarian text, like it portrays itself to be, that is following Jesus and Messiah and saying that he came back from the dead and talked to him. So now the same Jesus who got into a fight with the Pharisees and called them children of Satan because they didn't listen to his message is saying that some people who follow him have turned and now they're serving Satan, and that they're part of a synagogue of Satan. So it's interesting that Jesus never uses the term church. Church, you can say that he did when he told Peter, on this rock I will establish my church. But ecclesia in Greek means a community. So it can be, it used to be used for like the council of the governors of Rome. So he's saying, I'm going to build a group of people that follow my decrees or something like that. So he's saying that about the so-called church. And then suddenly he's talking about a synagogue, which is another term for a congregation, but now it's in Latin or it's also in Greek. So now you have this very Jewish guy talking to another very Jewish guy saying there are some Jews that claim to be Jews and there are not, and they have joined the synagogue of Satan. So it's like I'm from Mexico, and I said there's some Mexicans that are not being Mexican enough, and they're demonic Mexicans. And it's like, what the heck is that? Demonic Mexicans according to whom and how? And how does he define it? As idolatrous and immoral. So going back to the god of Akron and him being accused of being a pagan, how do you describe a pagan in the Bible? Someone who's immoral, someone who's sexually deviant, someone who does not follow the guidelines of the God of Israel. So the reason there was so much animosity with the Canaanites was because they were sacrificing the children to gods, they were having temple prostitutes as a form of worship, and they were living destructive lives. So again, if Beliar means the god of wickedness, of destruction, and he's saying that people are joining that, he is admonishing his own people as you're misbehaving and you're not following my decrees, which all are in line with Torah and with Judaism. Now, him going to religious leaders, let's say that I was a governor in Mexico, and I go to other governors and say, you guys are destructive. You guys are not living up to the constitution of the Mexican people. You guys are satanic and demonic in your path. What I'm saying in a metaphorical sense is that you are working against what we all agree on, is that we need to be fighting for our people and living to positive standards and setting a good example. So if you want to make it all mystical and say that Satan has a grasp on the Jewish people and that he stops them from believing, then you open all cans of worms that they don't want to think about. So every time that a Christian misbehaves, is he demonic? Has he been taken over by a Satan? Because a lot of people will say, the devil made me do it, or they're not real Christians when they were torturing crypto Jews in Spain and Mexico back in the Inquisitional times. So you're saying that the devil is running rampant around the world and taking possession of people, and that there's groups of people who have already given themselves up to Satan. When I'm going to read you another passage, and this passage is actually very disturbing because it kind of throws everything I'm saying to the side. I know that this is a very serious conversation, and we're taking a lot of time of our audience, but this is where we have to depart from the New Testament sometimes and be like, whoa, these guys truly believe that everybody was under the power of the devil. This is what Acts chapter 26, 17, 18 says. And this is Jesus again, who spoke to Paul in Hebrew. It says that in one of the passages. So he's a Jewish messianic contender speaking to a Jewish guy who just had a revelation that he is the Messiah after all. And this is what he says. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. So he's saying the Jews are going to come after you because they don't like me. I am sending you to them, turning them from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So was Jesus saying that the whole world was the power of Satan? Was Jesus saying that the only elect in the eyes of God are the ones that follow him? That's what he's saying. If you look at the idea of having an elect group, it goes back to Elijah being disappointed that nobody would defend him against Queen Jezebel, and him telling God, hey, I've been faithful, where's everybody at? And God tells him that he has saved a group of people that still follow him and they're in hiding or something like that. So in apocalyptic groups, they believe that they were the only ones who had kept the covenant. And you see that with the Qumranic community. So now Jesus says that he made a pact with all his followers, and that they're the ones who are keeping whatever's left. They're the remnant. Now, in this mystical vision, Paul gets a mandate from Jesus that wherever you go, they're going to hate you because of me. And it's a spiritual battle. It's not even a physical one. It's because they're in league with Satan. And by you preaching the gospel, you're breaking the curse. And now you're taking them from Satan to God, from the power of the devil to the power of God. And you're opening their eyes. So one time, and this is where I get in trouble. I told someone who was very staunch about anybody that doesn't believe Christianity is satanic or under the kingdom of the Antichrist. And they went down the line, and it was kind of silly because they were using a passage from one of the letters of John, and they were saying, those who are Antichrist are the ones that deny that Jesus came in the flesh. Those that are Antichrists that deny that he has the power of God. And those that are Antichrists are working against the purposes of the apostles or something like that. And I said, oh, so if you're not a Christian, you're Antichrist. And he's like, whoa, I never said that. It's like, you just said that. You said that anybody who stands against those three doctrines of the Christian church is Antichrist. But again, if you come from 2,000 years of tradition of Christianity, it's very simple. The power of Christ and the church of Christ versus the Antichrist and the synagogue of Satan and all those people. But if you look at those sectarian groups, they all thought that they were the ones that God wanted under them. They all thought that they were the golden child in the eyes of God. If there is a Messiah, which is inferred in the Hebrew scriptures, is not fully fleshed out, and there must be in their eyes, just like if there's a God, there must be a devil. If there's a Christ, there must be an Antichrist. But the way that Antichrist is defined by Paul and also in John is whoever is standing against Christ. But we, Tony and I, know the teachings of Jesus are love God, serve him, treat your fellow man with respect, see the pirkua nefesh, the holiness, the sanctity of every person, all these Jewish and Torah perspectives. So if you really think about it, to be anti-Jesus Christ is to be anti his mandates and his loving stuff. I might get in trouble for defending him, defending Paul, but if you look at it from a rational perspective, they were preaching self-restraint. They were teaching kindness, love, compassion, nonviolent retaliation. Is weird that I call it nonviolent retaliation, because he said if someone mistreats you, you're supposed to be kind to them, and that brings conviction on them. So all these principles, which now are integral part of Judaism, and they were back then, is what he was teaching. So if someone's teaching hatred, mistreatment, lack of respect, that's someone who's anti the teachings of this messianic contender. That's what Antichrist means. So when they get all creepy and coming up to Halloween, where there's a devil under every rock and everybody who doesn't agree with you is from the devil, that is the thing that we had another guy come on the show who was saying that all the philosophers from the Greeks would call their enemies and their deterrents demonic, evil, and stuff like that. It's a way of undermining their perspective. So when Jesus fights against the injustice of the Pharisees because they're being critical of everyone that is not like them, when he fights against the Sadducees for making the temple a market, when he fights against the Herodians for picking a king that was not just, and the people that supported Pilate and stuff like that, he's fighting against a system that is not divine or holy. So people who are not holy are the people who are antichrist, who are a synagogue of Satan, something like that. Not the people who are behaving. Even Jesus said, I did not come for the healthy, I came for the sick. So he only handles sick people or people that he considers to not be meeting his standards or the standards of God. Now his followers start saying that anybody that doesn't like them, that doesn't agree with Jesus being the Messiah, that they're all part of this kingdom of destruction and wickedness. And if they're going against the Romans, I can see that. If they're going against corrupt religious leaders, I can see that. But to make a blanket statement that anybody who doesn't understand or want anything to do with their movement, that is a typical thing that all the sectarian groups will do. And the Qumranic community, the one that this guy supposedly understands so well, they were saying that it was them and everybody else was in league with Beliar. But Beliar, the leader of the armies of darkness, was the Roman Empire. So what I told someone, and this is how I got kicked out of one group, is that the throne of Satan, Laodicea, is in Turkey. Laodicea was under the Roman Empire. That's what Jesus says in the book of Revelation. To say that someone is part of Satan's kingdom or congregations or whatever is to say that they're in league with the Roman understanding of the world, which was very oppressive. Half of the population were slaves. The women were second-class citizens. All the territories were used for the gain of Rome. That's what the early Jesus movement was fighting. It was fighting the mentality that humans are disposable. So that's why you need a rational perspective. If you make everything mystical, everybody's your enemy, and that's how cults get created. So what makes me sad is that within Christianity and Islam, there's a lot of people that take everything as written, like completely literal. So then they start making these assumptions. If you don't like what the Jews are doing in Hollywood, they must be in league with Satan. If you don't like what the Jews are doing in Wall Street, they must be in league with Satan. And it's like, what about all the non-Jews who are doing that? Oh, well, they're just misguided Christians. Oh, they're just misguided Muslims or secular people. That's the problem. It's like they're looking for ammunition to push their agenda and to support their preconceived notions. And they find it in a holy book, which is, to me, is the saddest thing. A book that is supposed to help people grow and make them into better people is being used in a distorted way to push hatred, discrimination, and even violence at times. So we are leading up to what was happening 100 years ago in Germany, and people don't see it. They're like, oh, you're just being whiny. You're just paranoid. Tony, you're coming from growing up atheist and agnostic, being involved with the Christian community. Now you feel more connected to Judaism. Do you see this, or am I crazy?
No, you're not crazy at all. So from my transition from like nominal Christian or mainstream Christianity, which was more non-denominational, the teachings were over. It was over and over and over. It's like, pray for Israel, but they're doomed. They didn't need Jesus. They're doomed. And then you go off, and then I became more messianic, Hebrew roots. I went through that phase. And the anti-Semitism was it's insane over there. I was, and I almost fell for some of it, but then I had to come back and take a rational approach and then do some introspection. And I started seeing a lot. I was like, why? It's like every turn I'd look, you have this misunderstanding of like even something as simple as the Hebrew language. Then you've got people arguing over calendars, and it's like, well, hey guys, the Jewish people have been doing it for thousands of years. Like, why don't we just go learn from them? And it's like anything Jewish, it's like the devil's attached to it. And I'm thinking, but why? Why? And I think it's got something to do with this cult think, with people eisegetically taking texts and cherry picking texts and then making doctrines out of them. Because it's weird. Like Jesus will say, like, be wary of the Pharisees, the leaven of the Pharisees. But then in another area, he says, when the Pharisees and the scribes sit in the seat of Moshe, do all they tell you to do. And you're like, hold on, what? Right. And so you have this dilemma that's going on. And I think it's really crucial to really approach the scriptures, not just from a religious perspective, which entails, a lot of mysticism and things like that, and to really approach it, like you said, from a rational perspective, to understand it from an academic perspective. That way you can get more of a context historically, religiously, politically, all of these different things going on. And then you get a different picture. I see Jesus teaching to come back to God with all of your heart, because of some of the things that were going on in the first century. You had oppression from the Romans, you had sectarian groups of Judaism, you had the multifacets of Judaisms at the time. And then it's like, as I've studied Jewish texts and I'm starting to see the correspondence of what Jesus is teaching, I see him lining up more so along the lines with the edicts of Beit Hillel, right, rather than Shammai. And so I see this harmony within Judaism, that when I was in Christianity, I always had questions, because I was like, God loves the Jewish people. You have texts in the prophets like Isaiah where God says, as long as the law for the stars, the sun, moon, and stars are in the heavens, Israel will be a nation before me. And you're like, okay, well, how do we fit this New Testament in there when God's already made these statements? And so I think what it is, it's people not approaching the scriptures from the context that they need to be kept in, which is a highly Jewish context. And so I think it's equivalent to somebody going to another country with a different culture. They don't understand anything of that culture, and they're just jumping to conclusions without really delving deep and diving into the culture, the traditions, and asking the questions, and then having that relationship to get to know the people of the culture. And in this case, the people of the book, right? And so this is very crucial, imperative. And I think just the fact that me and you are having this conversation, I think it's telling of the times that reconciliation needs to be made, because we need to air out the differences. And it's like the New Testament is not a blanket transcendent indictment against all Jewish people. When I read the New Testament, I see every accusation thrown at Pharisee or anything is at leadership. You've got Jesus going around to the common people and meeting them where they're at, and teaching them and giving them hope in a time of oppression and suffering, right? And so it's like, come back to God. God hasn't forsaken you. It's okay. It's okay. God loves you. I am the way, the truth, and the life. How do we reconcile this instead of some abstract, esoteric knowledge of, whatever this set group is saying what it means? Well, I see Jesus always reprimanding immoral behavior, treating people unjustly. And you see him, he says in Matthew 23, listen to what they tell you when they sit in the seat of Moshe. But then a couple of verses later, he says, woe to you scribes and Pharisees who tithe the anise and the cumin, but forget the weightier matters of the Torah. So it's like, okay, we have to reconcile all of it as a whole, right? It's about immoral behaviors. It's about loving God, staying faithful, loving your fellow man, and practicing common decency and showing compassion, and knowing that all of us are human. We all fall short, and we need to love one another and edify one another and be there for one another when we're going through tough times, because suffering happens, trauma happens, bad things in life happens. Some of the greatest men in history, and I think when we read the whole of the Tanakh, we see, like you said before, the patriarchs are men. just like me and you. They make mistakes. And I think that's the beauty. And one of the most, when you really dissect all of the Hebrew scriptures, you take away all the stories and all that of these patriarchs' lives, and you just look at the morality and ethics. It's the most moral and ethical book of all time. And it still is to this day. And Jesus didn't come teaching anything different. It's the same concepts. And when you don't understand Judaism, it's easy. This is why I'm a little bit more long suffering and I see how people come to erroneous conclusions when it comes to the Hebrew scriptures. It's because they're not taking everything into context. They're not looking at Jewish literary writings. I've got friends all the time that say, yeah, but God sent, the Jews to go over here to go kill these people and kill women. I'm like, you're not understanding context. You're not understanding context. Or you'll see, well, Jesus said this about the Jews. And I'm like, he is a Jew. Right? So you have to understand that in that context, Jews speaking to Jews. Jesus wasn't going around talking to the Romans. He was dealing with people who knew who grew up with the Hebrew scriptures, who grew up knowing some of these concepts. And when you don't understand these concepts, it's easy to completely go off trail and have these weird ideas about things. So like you said about Revelation, it's about, it's an indictment against his followers, not Jews. It's like, no, you're acting immoral. You're doing things that are completely antithetical to what I taught, which is Torah Judaism in its essence. And so it's the hatred's got to stop. It's just, and it's due to ignorance. It's due to ignorance. And this is why I appreciate podcasts like this, because it brings to light a lot of these issues to be able to, for people that are looking for the truth to understand, to deep dive into these topics, so that we can bring to light, so people can, a more clear picture can be painted instead of this indictment against the Jewish people.
Tony, how are you doing on time? Is there any way you can give me another 40 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, so we're gonna do this as 2 shows. I have to split up the 40 minutes from each section. In the next segment, we're gonna read an article from Biblical Archaeology Review, and there it says exactly what the Synagogue of Satan means. So I got kicked out of a Facebook group because I said what this guy Jörg Frey was saying is not correct. To indict, like you're saying, the Jewish people and use the Book of Revelation to do it, it's poor scholarship and bad interpretation on his part. Because again, he did not set it up like we did. He did not say Jesus was a Jew, John was a Jew. He was coming after other Jewish Christians. He was explaining that all the churches were misbehaving. So he's calling one of the churches members of the Synagogue of Satan. So it's saying, you disappoint me so much that, like he told Peter, you're a Satan to me. And in Hebrew, Hasatan means an accuser or an adversary. So if you just go straight to the devil, straight to the enemy of God, you don't even understand what people were talking about back then. If I told Tony, you're a Huckleberry Finn to me, it's like, unless you know American literature, you don't even know what that means. You might think that I am insulting him when I'm actually telling him that's my favorite book. So again, context, understanding the language, understanding what's going on. And it's interesting that when Frey was writing, he said they jump around from Satan to diabolos. And if you take the word demon in Greek, it means something completely different than in Hebrew. Who knows what diabolos meant? The same thing with the god of the eon. The god of the eon actually sounds very Gnostic. And then the Gnostics flipped it and they said that the God of the Old Testament was demonic and the God in the New Testament was positive. So it's all about the glasses you're wearing too. If you have an anti-Semitic filter on your glasses, you're going to see everything as anti the Jews. They might say that I'm actually trying to justify the Jews and get them off the hook. That's why I read that verse where it says that he's anybody who persecutes Paul is in league with Satan. But why are they persecuting him? They got. I'm going to read you another part, and that's how we'll start the next segment. I'm going to read you the things that no one ever discusses that are crucial to the New Testament, and when you bring it up, people actually hate you for. So we'll do that in the next segment. Thank you for listening. Welcome to another episode of Mystic Skeptic Radio's Raiders of the Unknown. In our last episode, we were discussing a very controversial, difficult subject. Are Jews in league with Satan or the devil? And the reason we're doing this is not to cause trouble or to stir up pain in people's hearts. I know we're in the middle of the highest holy time in Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But as we are being self-reflective and celebrating God's impact in our lives, other groups think it's okay to still be talking trash and defaming us and vilifying us left and right. So what prompted this was on a Facebook group from a prominent Christian leader. They were allowing someone who had, he claims he's not, but everything he said was a neo-Nazi. Like, he even talked about how he grew up not being allowed to defend Hitler. And then he said, well, I'm not an anti-Semite. I have Jewish friends, but every chance I get, I try to tell people that the narrative is wrong. And he's talking about the Jewish narrative of the Holocaust. So come on. So then he started saying that the synagogue of Satan this and the synagogue of Satan that. And it was prompted by something I said. And so the moment you bring up anything Jewish in mainstream Christian groups, and this is why Facebook is actually a cesspool of sad environment to get anything, because everybody, even the people that are not anonymous, they're anonymous. They can say anything they want, and then if you call them out, they either kick you out of the group or they block you, whatever. So one thing that he brought up, and this is a different subject, but I really want to bring this home. Okay, so why is it that YouTube in the previous iteration of Twitter stop allowing anti-Semitic stuff? Was it because we control everything and we want to keep people away from the truth? It was because the different Jewish organizations are worried, like I said previously, that we're turning into Germany in the 1930s. So what they did is they came together and they said, how can we get these private organizations to not allow the Alex Joneses and other people to keep talking trash? So, well, they survive on revenue from advertising. So why don't we talk to all the big corporations that advertise on YouTube and Twitter and tell them, hey, do you really want to support a company that lets anti-Semites run wild? And they said, I don't know about that. And it's like, so if you can join us, we can pressure them to start banning people who are all they're spouting is hatred. But that's against free speech. But it's also, again, in England, they had an issue with radical Muslim clerics. In England has more freedom than here. And they would let people say all kinds of horrible stuff, including take down the government and take over, until they realize that if you let people talk like that, some people will actually listen and do it. So then they started squeezing on people not saying horrendous stuff. And this is, if you look at it from a libertarian and conservative perspective, you allow someone to migrate to this country, and then they say this country is crap. You can say, oh, well, that's free speech, but it's detrimental to the morale of the place. So we're only 2% of the population. And you say, oh, well, you have too much power to force Twitter and YouTube to do that. Yeah, but we're 2% of the population because half of us got killed in Germany 100 years ago. And they're like, you're just being babies. It's like, dude, there's 16 million Jews, the same amount of Jews that were 100 years ago. We haven't grown. We're actually fading away. So you would think that what we say matters. Like, oh, you make too many movies about the Holocaust, because nobody cares, and we need to put it in front of them. So that's the kind of asinine hatred that this guy was pushing. And so I responded to his synagogue of Satan. Everybody doesn't love Jesus is part of the devil's army or whatever. And that's when they came after me. But this was This was my response. Tell me, good sir, have you ever considered that anti-Judaism is really anti-Semitism? And people say, oh, how can you blame ancient people for being anti-Semitic? Which anti-Semitism means hating Jews. You know, they didn't hate Jews, they hated Judaism or whatever. They always come up with some weird caveat. And I'd be like, theological anti-Semitism is hating Jews for not being Christians or not giving up Judaism. Ethnic anti-Semitism is hating Jews for being Jewish by descent or ethnicity. But either way is hating Jews. So Semite means someone from descendant of Shem, and some people want to pile Arabs and other groups in it. But the original term in German means hating Jews. So either you hate them because of their background or you hate them because of their religion. Either way, it's still hatred. So now you want to say, well, you can be anti-Jewish in the sense that you hate Judaism and you think Judaism is stupid, but that doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic. Once that person becomes a Christian, then you love them. You're still doing the thing you're not supposed to be doing. You're still hating people. And then my ancestors became Catholic and they still got hated as false Christians. The conversos were seen as spies or something like that. So even if you convert, they still hate you. So at the end, it just goes back to hating people irrationally. One way, you find a way to hate them. So this is what my response to this guy. Tell me, good sir, have you ever considered anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism as one of the worst sins of the apostolic era? And I was talking Christian to him because Christians think that, okay, fine, God loved the Jews until Jesus, and then that was it. So the apostles are somehow Gentiles, or at least Gentile-leaning. So Jesus died for their sins, and then they gave up Judaism, they became Greco-Roman Christians. Okay, fine, if that's what you want to think. First, you know Jesus was a devout Jew who lived a faithful life to the ordinances of his ancestors, and his apostles were religious Israelites partaking of God's covenant with Moses. Oh, well, that's until Jesus showed up because he told them they were wasting their time. Okay, well, let me give you some examples. Jesus could have said, don't worry about anything, but believe in me. But he didn't just say that. He said in the Gospels that keeping the mitzvot or commandments were important to achieve eternal life. In Matthew 19:17 and Mark 10:18, he says, if you would enter life, keep the commandments. In his definition of the commandments, and this is where there can be caveats, he said, do not murder, do not steal, do not lust after someone else's wife. So he only gave the 10. So he said, okay, well, the 10 are fine because those were brought in to the New Testament. The rest are done. Okay, fine. But one of them that is never discussed is keeping the Sabbath. And the first one is to love the Lord your God, or is to acknowledge that the God of Israel is God. So not only is he saying that the deity of the Jews is the only deity, he's saying that the commandments, the main ones, and Judaism considers the 10 commandments very important as well, those are important. And he says, because the rich fool says, what must I do to achieve eternal life? And he says, keep the commandments. He doesn't say, believe in me. And this is where you see a difference between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. He says, keep the commandments. And then the kid says, I've done this all my life. And he says, okay, then go sell all your stuff. So he's pushing him to the next level. So there's basic Torah keeping, which is something that we know in Judaism. And then there's the divine aspect, or the Agadah of keeping Judaism even further. They call it, Abraham Joshua Heschel calls it the heavenly Torah, which is going the extra mile for God, or being a pious Jew or a Hasid. So he's telling this guy to be a Hasid, when most people say, no, he's not telling him to be a Hasid. He's telling them, you wasted your time keeping the commandments. What you need to do is give up everything and pick up a cross and follow after me. That's how they interpret it. But as a Jew, I can see that he's saying, okay, fine, you've been doing great. Now I want you to go further, and then you can be accounting on the people that will inherit the Olam Haba, or the world to come. So all of that is very Jewish. Now, the part about picking up the cross, that can be a symbol of martyrdom. They take it as picking up the cross as living a Christian life. Whatever you want to think of it, the original context was Jewish. Then Paul partook of a Nazarite vow found in the Torah to show other Jews that he was not teaching heresy by saying that the law was of no relevance in their lives. So in Acts 18:18, James tells Paul, go ahead and finish the vow. You're growing your hair and you're doing the things. We had a show up about the Nazarite vow. He was doing all that. And he says, hey, finish it off. Go submit a sacrifice at the temple. And then they'll know that you're not telling Jews to stop keeping Torah. That's what it says in the book of Acts, a Christian text. The same Christian text that is when Stephen accuses all Jews of killing the prophets. And then Paul actually accuses them later too. But in that instance, you see traces of actual Jewish practice on the same guy who says all of that is of no value. My life in Judaism is over, but then he's doing that. So then the response that I get is like, well, he was just doing it to get Jews to believe in Jesus. He was going to the temple, performing a Levitical rite, which according to you guys has no value and no importance because Jesus already did the ultimate sacrifice. Just to show off, so then all the accusations against Paul are true, that he is a chameleon and he is someone who would do anything to get people to believe in Jesus, which makes no sense in the context of what's going on. So again, they don't want to hear that. And so the final part is John the Revelator, which we've been discussing, says those that are Jews or are not, he meant pretenders. There's this idea that Bill Schofield says from Mark Nanos that back then the Jews had a special relationship with Rome. Since the time of Herod the Great, they made a deal that as long as they paid tribute to Rome, the Jews be allowed to perform their religion without being persecuted. So there's an idea in scholarly circles that some Christians who weren't Jewish originally were going and getting circumcised to be seen as Jews because they knew that it was a Jewish Christian movement, and then they would be not persecuted for being part of the Jesus movement. I find it a little far-fetched. Let's say that it was true. And then that's why Paul was so nasty against this circumcision group, that they were saying, if everybody gets circumcised, you not only make us happy, you're cool with Rome, and then that's it. Nobody's going to come after us. It's a stupid plan because they were coming after them for other reasons. But again, you have to really dig deep, because when Nero burned down Rome, he wasn't coming against Gentile Christians. He was coming against the Jewish Christian movement. And when you start saying the word Christian, it confuses people. But the Jewish movement of Jesus, which had Gentiles in it, was accused of burning down Rome, and then they came after everybody. So again, if you don't know history, you're making stuff up, and you're not realizing the problem of what was happening back then. Maybe that was why, or there was people who were not faithful Jews. They were careless or immoral, and he was coming after them for that. But that's the next part. There are Christians that call Judaism carnal, like we mentioned in the previous segment, or they say that you are Judaizing if you're telling people to become Jewish. Well, there was no Judaizing at that time, and that's an anachronistic term made by the church fathers, because everybody was Jewish. So if you, as a non-Jew, walk into a synagogue and you say, hey, guys, tell me about God, I want to know, are those guys Judaizing, or are you coming to them for support and for help? So now the dirty word and the heresy among Christians starting in the 3rd century is that a Christian would run into a Jew, and the Jew would be like, forget about all that Christian stuff, come join us. So that's when they became paranoid, and Constantine said, let's get rid of all the Jewish stuff because it's too confusing. You're going to go back to those guys when Paul already said that all that stuff is nonsense? So they interpreted Paul incorrectly, and then they used it as an excuse to not follow the commandments of God, which they said they were of no value. So even though Jesus said that they were of value, suddenly they're of no value because all you need is Jesus. But if Jesus was a Jew and he kept the commandments faithfully and you're his disciple, why are they unimportant? Let's say that not all of them apply to Gentiles. Still, you would think that the ones that are helping you in your moral life and the ones that helping you grow as a person would be still applied. And that's what Acts 15 is all about, but that's a completely different conversation. So then back to, if the Jews are part of the synagogue of Satan, or they're the, this guy was saying that the book of Revelation, there's this weird part where it says that Jerusalem is a harlot and that she rides on the beast. But then it says that it's that Jerusalem is surrounded by 7 hills. So he's mixing Rome as the harlot. Harlot is a symbol in the Old Testament of a wayward wife or a woman who's lusting after other gods. So who in that time was where did they have the pantheon of the gods? But in Rome. So he's saying that either the Jews are becoming like the harlot by taking on Greek practices and becoming Hellenized, or that where they crucified the Lord, that's what it says in Revelation, that Jerusalem has become outpost for Rome, and that the Sadducees, which were appointed by Rome, are acting against God. So again, if you don't know history, you're going to say the Jews are the harlot because Jerusalem is a part of the Jews and the Jews love Jerusalem. And then every Jew who doesn't believe in Jesus is part of that. And even the ones that believe in Jesus, we got to keep an eye on them. And it's just paranoid nonsense. So, but the synagogue of Satan was the last part that I was trying to, and the Judaizing thing. So later Greco-Roman patristic leaders who were not familiar with Second Temple Judaism make all kinds of accusations against the Jews. They distort the teachings of Paul and use his antagonism against other Jewish folks in extreme elements within the Jesus movement. So Paul had fights with everybody. And they take that and then they apply it to modern Jews or ancient Jews or whatever. So like we were saying, even Jesus only criticized poor leadership and inconsistent behavior of fellow Jews, not all of God's instructions in the Torah. If he did, he would contradict his father. Again, if you don't even understand Christian theology, shouldn't be talking, which would be a form of patricide. So if Jesus is the Son of God and he comes and says, who cares what my father said? I will tell you the way. That makes no sense. And that's what the Gnostics were saying. They were saying the God of the Old Testament is wicked and mean and aggressive. I'm a God of love and peace. So there's been a lot of crazy stuff coming up and stirring up lately. They kind of show that they're either going Gnostic or they're creating their own heresies without even realizing. So for Eastern and Western Christianity to propose that, it's so incongruent with the New Testament that it almost pushes us as Jews to have to reclaim the New Testament and teach it to them, so then they stop hating on us. And they're like, well, who are you to teach us our own text, and you don't have the Holy Spirit or whatever? But again, it's like, if you don't understand Judaism, the New Testament becomes nonsensical. And a lot of the stuff that they're pushing is counterproductive for their own life. Like, how can you follow a book that has so many holes in it, and when you fill it in with Judaism or ancient Jewish apocalyptic thinking or the Tanakh, then it starts making a little more sense? Well, this is something that's been happening, and it's outrageous. A scholar that we had on the show, and God rest his soul, was saying that the only way you can understand the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, is by understanding Babylonian, Canaanite, and Egyptian mythology. So where are we going with this? And again, I don't want to sound like the people that I can't stand, like Alex Jones and all those guys, but I want to hear from Tony before I read the article from the Biblical Archaeology Review. If your only source of interpretation is the pagan or the world around the Israelites, then you come to Jesus. What are you going to think of Jesus? Because if Jesus is the promised Messiah of the Old Testament, and the Old Testament can only be interpreted and understood by Babylonian, Canaanite, and Egyptian ideas, then what is Jesus to humanity?
That makes Jesus that's so if you can only interpret the Hebrew scriptures through outside influence, that's weird. I don't I in essence what I see that doing is ultimately, again, the Jews don't, it's underlying anti-Semitism. It's because what you're saying is the Jewish people don't know anything. You can't rely on the Jewish people themselves to interpret their own texts. You have to go to outside sources. So in essence, it's taking that which God gave to his people as this revelation at Sinai and basically saying, you don't know anything. It's so weird. To me, it's like somebody coming from another country coming to America and then trying to tell an American, you don't understand the US Constitution. It's so weird. And it's another undermining of the Jewish people. It's like everywhere I turn, even scholarly academic works, theological debates, it always has this underlying premise that the Jews don't know anything. And so, that's just a weird view. I don't see how logically or rationally someone can come to that conclusion, because what you're doing in essence is relying on idolatry to interpret scripture, which the scriptures you're trying to interpret are completely against. It's so weird. And then it says, and not just that, but what the Torah itself says, that the hidden things belong to the Lord, and the revealed things belong to the children of Israel, so that they can keep the Torah for all time. So it's just like, it undermines text. And I think this is a problem when you dissect scriptures and you try to come up with doctrines with just cherry picking things, and you're not looking at the totality of things as a whole.
What's happening is we're having people who are looking back at ancient forms of Christianity, forms that are not interested in a Hebraic, Judaic perspective. And you don't have to love Judaism. Again, we're not trying to say everybody needs to be pro-Jewish. What we're saying is don't be anti-Jewish. So if you don't care what we have to say, that's fine. But don't create systems that are in opposition to something you don't understand. And don't build up a safe ground for all these wild theories to be let in. So you said something that was very crucial. You said that going to an African American and saying, I'm going to teach you the history of slavery, or going to a white American and saying, I know what happened with the Puritans, and I'm someone from China. Like, that's ridiculous. But people do that with the Bible all the time. We are coming full circle. The reason we started the show is because someone was pushing John Allegro's theory of the mushroom and the cross. In Mushroom of the Cross, you have an American scholar who's saying that he understands what the ancient Jews were going through, and it's all related to psychedelic drugs. And to me, it's like, you don't go to people and you tell them what you understand about their culture. You ask them. And I can show you many books from a Jewish perspective on how we've been misunderstood and how our religion it was developed. And I've never heard that the concept of Messiah came from the Babylonians. I've never heard that the concept of a dualistic battle between good and evil came from the Zoroastrians. I never heard any of that from a Jewish standpoint. And even from secular Jews, you might have one or two that are trying to outdo the non-Jews, but at the end, we believe that our ideas are personal and from our own connection with God. We can put religion aside and revelation and say the descendants of Abraham, which were all Babylonian originally, who settled in Canaan, they had their own experiences, they had their own revelation, they had their own dreams and aspirations, and that's what gave rise to Judaism. Jesus was one of them. He was a descendant of those people. So for him to come and proclaim that people are in league with Satan or misbehaving or something like that, that's within the context of their experience living in a world of idolatry, immorality, and injustice. That's what we're trying to convey. The Jewish interpretation of scripture, the Jewish perspective, which is all important, at least taking into consideration, will help you open and learn new things. So I'm going to read the article, like we're going to get a little more mutual. And what people might not know is that the guy who started Biblical Archaeology Society was actually Jewish, but he's willing to work with people from all different backgrounds. So Adela Jabro-Collins, who's actually, I think she's from Japan, she wrote this article about the Synagogue of Satan, and I was wrong. It's not Laodicea, it's actually Pergamon. So this is what she says. Quote, in the book of Revelation, a prophet named John experiences a vision of the risen Christ, who asks him to convey a message to each of the 7 Christian congregations of Asia Minor: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. To the Pergamon congregation, this is the message. And to the angel of the congregation that is in Pergamon, write, thus says the one who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you dwell, where the throne of Satan is, and you hold fast to my name, and you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. That's Revelation chapter 2, verse 12 to 13. On a symbolic level, the throne of Satan mentioned in this passage represents a power in opposition to God, a power that is embodied in Roman imperial might. Throughout Revelation, a system of symbols associates Satan, depicted as a dragon or serpent, with the Roman Empire and emperor depicted as a beast. Unlike the other early Christian writers, John the prophet did not encourage his audience to honor and obey the emperor, but instead encouraged by means of symbols and rhetoric resistance. In principle, during the first century of the Common Era, Roman officials tolerated believers in Jesus as the Messiah insofar as they could be regarded as Jews. Jews were expected to honor the emperor and to pray for his welfare, as well as for the welfare of the empire. As monotheists, however, they were normally not expected to worship the emperor, as most Greeks and Hellenized provincials did with enthusiasm. Nero's police action against the Christians of Rome in 64 Common Era, however, apparently set a precedent for executing Christians merely for being such. And by the time Trajan, emperor from 98 to 117, Christians who refused to curse Jesus Christ and to worship the emperor along with traditional gods were liable to execution as stubborn adherents of superstition. Nero's actions marked the beginning of the end of the Roman acceptance of Christianity as a Jewish movement. John's imagery in Revelation is more than symbolic. However, the very explicit association the author makes between the throne of Satan and the city of Pergamon suggests that something visible in the city inspired the phrase. Taken together, the archaeological and textual evidence points to the same candidate, the Great Altar of Pergamon, one of the most significant and stunning monuments to survive from the Greco-Roman world. To John of Revelation, it is the throne of Satan. Pergamon, modern Bergama in Turkey, is located in the Caicus River in western Asia Minor, in the region traditionally called Mysia. In John's time, Mysia was part of the Roman province of Asia. The oldest part of the city is the Acropolis, which is considered higher and steeper from the Acropolis of Athens. The earliest record of settlement comes from the Xenophon, a Greek lived in the 4th century. And then we go to the ruins of the ancient city visible today include a temple dedicated to Emperor Trajan and a theater on top of the Acropolis. The base of the great altar lies predominantly on terrace of the southern slope of the Acropolis, a lower city circle base of the Acropolis. So they're showing this image with the naked bodies. The Pergamon altar itself is now housed in the museum in Berlin, and it talks a lot about what the altar meant back then. The purpose of Pergamon's altar is uncertain and continues to provoke debate. What is the real altar and which means from sacrificed animals will be burned, or it was a victory monument with no sacrificial function? As for its date, however, a consensus emerged the great altar was constructed in 221 before Christ. The altar was probably dedicated to Zeus and Athena, and they have equal proportions. So this is all archaeological stuff. But the important part is that although previous scholars have identified the great altar with the throne of Satan in Revelation 2:13, these scholars did not have the benefit of recent archaeological and architectural research, and therefore inappropriately viewed the altar in isolation from the temples of Zeus and Athena. As Klaus Reit has shown, however, the design of the monumental complex built by Eumenes II makes clear that the great altar is related to both the temple of Athena and the temple of Zeus. So Jesus was fighting against the gods of the Greeks, and then and they believed in giants. They believed in the Titans. So although the giants were all destroyed, the Olympian gods lived on. According to Greek mythic traditions, the existence of these gods and the practice of offering sacrifice to them was problematic for ancient Jews and Christians. They dealt with the problem by identifying the gods of other peoples with the angels or demons. Among Greeks, this term was originally posited and meant gods, often of a minor type. Later, however, it became to mean demons, so to say daimones. According to Paul, Greeks and Romans were really sacrificing to demons, not gods. In the apocalyptic dualistic framework of the book of Revelation, Satan, as the chief of the fallen angels, would correspond to Zeus, the ruler of the gods. Deuteronomy 32:8 states that the Most High fixed the boundaries of the people of the earth. He made this their allocation. The Hebrew text states, according to the sons of Israel, but the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek text of Deuteronomy and Septuagint indicate the original reading was the sons of God and the sons of the gods. This Hebrew phrase was interpreted by the 2nd century Christian writer Justin Martyr to mean messengers of God or angels. Justin concludes that God had committed the care of human beings to angels. So now they're talking about the crux of the problem, and this is what Michael Heiser's followers are talking about day and night, is that all the gods of the nations are demons in the eyes of the New Testament writers. If that's the case, anybody who worships Zeus, Athena, or any other god is a follower of Satan. If that's the case, then there might be a possibility that Jesus is claiming, either through immorality or lack of devotion to the God of Israel, or by them being associated with Rome and being cruel like them, that the people who did not follow him were demonic. So again, that creates, there's a mystical component, but there's also a rational component. And if you're going to do that, then you do it for your own people. So how are the people who are criticizing us living a Hellenistic and non-biblical lifestyle? That would be my contention. It's like, you're worried about what they're doing over there. What about you, and how are you not living up? But I want to thank Tony for being here with us, and for helping us research more where all these ideas even come from. And it would be easy to just throw them out and say, well, it's just a bunch of baloney. They're religious fanatics fighting with each other or fighting with other religious fanatics from other different groups. But here in our program, we want to dig deep into where these concepts come from and how these concepts have consequences. So whenever we hear of someone reading a text and going berserk and causing harm, we have to understand that it's our responsibility to educate them and to give them other alternatives, so then they don't get as worked up and possibly cause damage to themselves or others. Tony, in the last 2 minutes, can you tell us what have you gleaned from this conversation, and how can this be helpful?
Oh, tremendously. Well, again, we go back to this dilemma of it's like theologically there becomes this cult think where automatically, no matter what viewpoint outside of Judaism you're looking at the text from, it actually, it's always something against the Jewish people. And I think that's what kind of drew me towards asking the questions and starting to build the relationship with my Jewish brothers and sisters and asking them questions, because it's like, when you think about bullying, it's unjust, and you see a child being for no apparent reason, just because someone doesn't like the way they look, the way they represent themselves. And so you see somebody being treated unjustly. Well, when I was growing up, that always drew me towards the person being bullied and made me want to be like the hero, like not in the sense of trying to gain esteem from people, but for the sense of just pure justice, it's like, why are you bullying him? What did he do to you? And so when you take that concept and you go into theological bullying, it's the same principle. And that's what drew me towards the Jewish people, because I'm like, everybody has a voice but the Jewish people. Let me give my ear and lend my ear to them, because ultimately, when I read the Tanakh, it says that, you know, that the 10 men from 10 nations will come and grab the hold of a garment, the garment of a Jew, and say, "Let us come with us, because we that you know God." So, and we see within the Jesus movement, Jesus himself saying to the Samaritan woman, you know, salvation is of the Jews, and we Jews know what we worship. So within the context of that, I think it does justice for anybody coming from any type of Christian background to really deep dive into these ideas and really ask the hard questions. Be solid in your faith. We're not trying to deter anybody from their faith. All we're trying to do is to bring harmony between the both groups, to stop the hatred. It's unnecessary. It's not fair. It's unjust, and it's time that we put it to rest. And it's like, no matter what I've seen from any type of anti-Semitic trope or whatever, it's always something to try to degrade the Jewish people, and it for no reason. Because every time I've looked into these things and these matters, it's always been some type of slander, or just to keep people away from the Jewish people. And I've always wondered, like, why is that? Because to my mind, to be antichrist is to be not against some type of, you know, esoteric thought, a thought of the mind, a mental assent per se. It's more of a going against what he taught. Righteousness and holiness and being just and kind and compassionate towards your fellow man and loving God with all your heart, soul, strength. So
let me finish the article so we get a clear picture of what they were saying. So this Hebrew phrase was interpreted by 2nd century Christian writer Justin Martyr to mean messengers of God or angels. Justin thus concluded that God has committed the care of human beings to angels. Then concluded from Genesis 6, which recounts how the sons of God fell in love with the human women, that the angels entrusted with the care of human beings transgressed this appointment by having sexual relations with human women. The children who were begotten in this way were demons. Justin went on to describe how these demons then subjected human beings to themselves and taught these humans to offer sacrifices, incense, and libations to themselves, the demons. Justin said that the Greek and Roman poets and mythologists did not know that it was the fallen angels and their offspring, the demons, who did these things, but thought that the demons were gods. From the point of view of the poet and mythologist, their people honored God himself, Jupiter or Zeus, and his brothers Neptune, Poseidon, Pluto, and Hades. From Justin's point of view, however, Zeus, Jupiter, was the leader of the fallen angels or demons, and thus the equivalent of Satan. Another factor that makes the great altar a likely candidate for the throne of Satan is his high position on the southern slope of the Acropolis. The cultures of the ancient Near East, Israelite religion, and Second Temple Jewish texts all attest to the tradition that the throne of a deity was on a mountain, or was the mountain itself. Adonai, the personal name of the Israelite God, was associated with Mount Zion, Baal with Mount Sephon, and Zeus with Mount Olympus. Zeus was also associated with other mountains. For example, an inscription found in the Cytopolis, Bet Shean, one of the cities of the Roman Decapolis in ancient Palestine and Transjordan, is dedicated to Zeus Akraios, the god of the mountain, and the fortress Acra. In Mesopotamia, the sun god Shamash was pictured sitting on a throne that was depicted as a stylized mountain. The throne of Solomon is described in 1 Kings 10:19 and 2 Chronicles 9:18 as having 6 steps. Geo Windengreen has argued that the 6 steps together with the seat made the throne of Solomon like the world mountain with the 7 tiers of the Mesopotamian tradition. If so, the structure of the throne would suggest to audiences of Kings and Chronicles that Solomon's throne was modeled on God's own throne, the world mountain. The book of Revelation expresses the expectation that God's throne will be on earth in the new age. The new Jerusalem will come down from heaven after the creation of the new heaven and new earth. Revelation 21:1-2. God's throne will be in the city, and from it will flow the river of the water of life. Revelation 22:1. John characterized his own time, however, a period of which Satan was actively working through other human beings to afflict and persecute the followers of the risen Christ. Revelation 2:9 and 13. The dramatic account of the battle in heaven, which Satan cast down to earth, Revelation 12:7-9 and 17 also reflects the idea that Satan is still powerful on earth. According to John, Satan will wreak havoc until he's seized and bound with the chain of the pit for 1,000 years. At that time, some of the dead will rise and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. At the end of the spirit, Satan will be thrown into the lake of fire and tormented forever and ever. Since divine thrones on earth were depicted as mountains, John may have adopted this image for Satan's earthly throne as well. The hypothesis that John imagines Satan as having a throne on earth finds support in depictions of many thrones of gods, heroes cut into rocks in Asia Minor. Some of these date the prehistoric, Mycenaean, and Archaean times, others later. A good example is the throne on the peak of the mountain near Magnesia, the region traditionally called Lydia. In John's message to Pergamum, the risen Christ says that Antipas, my faithful witness, was killed among you where Satan dwells. Where Satan dwells is synonymous with the throne of Satan, a phrase that occurs earlier in the same verse. The term witness implies that Antipas made public verbal testimony of Christ. The Greek term translated witness later took connotation of one who's been executed by the authorities because of loyalty to Christ. The use of the term here implies that Antipas was interrogated by a Roman emperor. And going back to the beast, was from the sea and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation and all who dwell upon the earth. This is Revelation 13. In John's time, this depiction only fit the Roman Empire and the emperor. It is explicitly stated the dragon Satan has given the authority to the beast. Furthermore, among those who enthusiastically accepted Roman rule, the Roman emperor was understood to be Zeus' agent on earth, or even to be identified with Zeus himself. The link between the emperor and Zeus makes sense of the portrayal of the death of Antipas in the place where Satan dwells and he's anointed. They also said that the emperor's, in John's view, the Roman governor, the emperor's agent, was a tool of Satan. It was worshipped as Zeus in his temple on the great altar. So all this is archaeological stuff that keeps going. But this is an important part. In Hellenistic and Roman periods, the god of the Jews, Samaritans, and Christians was often understood by outsiders as equivalent to Zeus, Roman Jupiter. According to 2 Maccabees 6:2, Antiochus Epiphanes rededicated the temple in Jerusalem to Zeus Olympius and the Samaritan temple in Mount Gerizim to Zeus Senios, the friend of strangers. It would have been a small step for John to invert this common perception into the identification of Zeus with Satan. The notion that Satan has given his power and throne and great authority to the beast would be John's critical assessment of the idea current in the province of Asia at that time. The domination was the embodiment of the power of Zeus on earth. In sum, the throne of Satan in Revelation will have evoked both Zeus and Roman emperor for the earliest audiences of Revelation. Michael and the angels defeat the great dragon, and his angels in heavenly battle cast them down to the earth. In the next vision, a beast arises from the sea. This is an allusion to the defeat of the Jewish revolt against Rome in 70 CE. The beast was also given authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. Only to Rome could such authority be attributed in the first century. The beast has 7 heads, and one of the heads has a mortal wound. But this wound was healed. The detail of the mortal wound was healed significant to other reasons. On one hand, it recalls Jesus, who was killed and rose from the dead. And then it says that Nero, according to a Roman historian, Nero committed suicide in 68. A rumor began to circulate immediately among supporters of the common people of Rome that he had escaped to the east and will return with an army to regain power in Rome. In the ongoing struggle between east and west, Nero would act as a savior king from the east. In the book 4 or 5 of the Sibylline Oracles, Jewish writers inverted this legend to depict Nero as an adversary of God and God's people in the last days. Instead of a savior king, John created a third version of the legend by portraying Nero as an antichrist figure, although he does not use the term. Just as Jesus died and was raised from the dead, also did Nero. He had received a mortal wound, yet he lived, just as the lamb who was slain also lived. The majority of Hellenized elite of Rome province of Asia, however, focused on the current living emperor, not on Nero. They placed domination at the focal point of mediation between the human and the divine, but in John's view, only Christ could play the role. So, again, we don't know exactly what was going on, but we know the context of what's happening. So if you ever run into someone who says, I know who the Antichrist is, and they try to point it to the mark of the beast, a chip being put on your vaccine, or some other stuff, just remember that the original context, let's say that it does have a prophetic aspect to it, but the original context was what the Christians were experiencing at that time. The same goes with Jesus. If Jesus is dealing with adversaries and people who don't like what he's saying and stuff like that, it would be easy for Jesus to use the language of that time and apply a demonic component to it, just like they were applying to him. So he could be reversing the accusation and putting it back to them. And, you know, he called, it says that the devil entered Judas, and it also says that Peter was called Satan, and then Jesus had a debate with Satan in the desert. So there's a lot of interesting things that we can look into, but at the end, when you apply it to a group of people, when you apply it to people that don't agree with you, when you apply it to, that is normal to every culture. We see it in politics where we demonize the other side because we don't agree with them, and we accuse them of things that maybe they never did, but we think they're planning or plotting. So just like any other people, Jews were capable of doing that back then, and now other groups are turning them against us. And even the concept of hell and the devil's bed, those are all Jewish, originally Jewish concepts. So it's sad that our texts are being turned against us. So again, thank you, Tony, for being part of this conversation. And this is one of the many topics that we will discuss in this new season. And hopefully we can get some experts to give us a more insight on what's going on. But I appreciate Tony being here so he can be my sounding board, because it's tough. It's tough to talk about these things. And I was just talking to someone yesterday about how when you are in the middle of your community and your family and stuff like that, the last thing you want to think is that people are capable of these things. So you justify it. So if a neo-Nazi sneaks into a thread and starts putting stuff, but he says the right words, you're always going to say, well, he's not really a neo-Nazi. He is misguided, or he has some good points, or I agree with him. And why are we being persecuted for our freedom of thought or something like that? It's like, yeah, but those thoughts can be put together and turn into something else. So if you don't like what we're saying, then come and debate us. But we know that we're standing on principles that are righteous, and I don't know what other people are trying to do. So again, we hope that we can keep the conversation going, and if you can bear with us for the next season. So thank you for listening to Raiders of the Unknown, part of Mystic Skeptic Radio.